Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
First of all, I'd like to thank each and every one of you who is here tonight. It's truly an honor for me to stand in front of you all and speak tonight. And I'd like to thank our lovely hosts, Mr. and Mrs. Hassan, for this opportunity they've given me for this evening. So, the topic that I chose is about the existence of God, and I've titled it The Case for the Existence of God. What I hope to do tonight is give something that traditionally you may not have heard. Something that when you go to madrasa, you're given arguments that you're all familiar with. So I'll try not to go along those lines. Perhaps I may hint them briefly, but I'd like to focus on something else. And so, with that, I'd like to begin. I'd like to start with this verse of the Quran, which is from Surah Al-Imran, verse 190, that says, إِنَّ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافِ اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ لَآيَاتٍ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. And I have the late Arthur J. Arbery translation here from the Quranic corpus that says, surely in the creation of the heavens and the earth, and in the observation of the night and day, there are signs for men possessed of minds. Literally, Ulil Albab means the possessors of the hearts. But it's been used to mean people who possess intellect, people who question. With that, I'd like to ask each and every one of you, just a few of you, why do you believe in God? I take it for a matter of assumption fact that everybody here believes in God. I'd like to know some thoughts from the audience. Why do you believe in God? What are some of the reasons you personally believe in God? Yes.
In this imperfect life, He is a ray of hope.
Okay. So for you, God symbolizes hope.
Yeah.
Okay. So you have a pragmatic approach towards your belief in God. It serves the purpose of giving you hope.
Yes.
Which is fine. Yes, I'm just thinking. Any other thoughts? Thank you for that.
Everything has a beginning, and the beginning of creation was from God.
Okay, so Najmul has an approach whereby everything has to have a start, and the primal cause has to be God. Any other thoughts?
Jamil.
Yes, Jamil.
There must be a creator of something so perfect, like the earth rotates. Someone's on this side of the earth, the other guy's on this side of the earth. Some people call it the earth is not flat, then how is not everyone falling down? So there must be a person that created something so perfect.
Okay, so Jamil is using nature to say that it's perfect, it's beautiful, has to be some sort of God behind it. So, I'd like to first start, what do you mean by God? Because we all take it for granted. I recall my childhood madrasa days where, the proof for the existence of God are. But nobody defined God for me. We implicitly assume God and then we try to justify His existence. Michelangelo painted something in the Sistine Chapel in which Adam was there, stark naked, pointing his fingers towards God, and God, a white man with white beard, also naked, with some angels extending his finger back, and the two fingers touching. It's considered a great work of art, and it's got a lot of symbolic meanings behind it. I'm not much of an expert of Michelangelo's works, but the description is fascinating. While I'm sure Michelangelo did not believe literally that God was a white man with a white beard, however, this notion does exist among most people. And there are many people who explicitly or implicitly believe in this kind of God, that God is somewhere out there, and He's going to pass judgment on each and every one of us. That is the understanding. You do good, heaven; you do bad, bye-bye, hell. To an atheist who doesn't believe in a God, to him, like Stephen Hawking, the late Stephen Hawking, for example, he wrote a book called A Brief History of Time, in which he ended by saying that if every human being, scientists, philosophers, thinkers, even the ordinary person could take part into the discussion of why we are here, once they discover what he believed was a theory of everything, then he said we would all truly know the mind of God. For Stephen Hawking, a brilliant mind, God was not the way a theistic person believes God to be. For Hawking, it would have been the mathematical equations of the universe, the theory of everything that tied the disciplines of physics together. And for a philosopher maybe, or a sophisticated theologian, God is the intelligence or the mind behind the cosmos. So not necessarily a white man with a white beard or a brown man with a brown beard, but an intelligence activity behind the cosmos. Now, as we proceed with this lecture tonight, we're going to touch a little bit about biology. We're going to touch a little bit about astrophysics, a bit of psychology, and some philosophy. And we're going to try to put it all together in what I'd like to make a coherent argument for the existence of God. By that I mean the third definition: an intelligence, a mind, a rationality, as the Christian says, the logos behind the universe. So, is there a God? This is a valid question that is not being asked. And it should be. It is not being asked, at least in our madrasas, it's not being asked by most Muslim communities at the seminar levels. Perhaps scholars are asking those issues. But it's a valid question. And the atheist Richard Dawkins believes that it's a scientific question. I differ with Dawkins on that regard. I do say it's a valid question, but I'm going to show it's not a scientific question, but it's another kind of question. So among many religious communities, this question in reality is hardly reflected upon. People don't give it much thought. God gives me hope. Not bad, it's fine. Life seems quite complex enough, The winds come, the waves go, There has to be a God. So we take God for granted, but this is not a good thing if you meet an atheist. Because the atheist has done his or her homework. And he or she will challenge you in your beliefs to the point where you may lose faith. I know, I used to be an atheist for 6 years of my life. And it's interesting, there was a former Archbishop of Canterbury, known as Bishop Harris, and he sat on stage with Richard Dawkins many years ago. And the moderator asked him, saying that Dawkins wrote a book called The God Delusion, showing that God is a delusion. And it sold millions of copies back then, 2 million afterwards. And he asked the bishop that, why is God making him so successful? Because the book is against the existence of God. And Bishop Harris said something very interesting. He said that atheism is a form of intellectual purification. Atheism is a form of intellectual purification. The atheist will challenge you to show you how good your understanding of God is. And if you get stuck, it shows that your understanding is very rusty. So it's good to have atheists, because that can make you a stronger believer if you get through that process. So let's get back to the reality of existence. We exist, the world exists, how do we explain it all? So the religious response, I'd like to summarize the typical religious response of the religious seminaries, or the average person would talk about this. So look at the complexity of the universe. And the argument, can a watch exist without a watchmaker? We've all heard of this. We heard it in madrasa, we heard it in schools. I remember when I was a teenager, I heard it at my secondary school. This argument actually traces back to Reverend William Paley. It was a very famous argument for some time, because how can you have a watch without a watchmaker? But then Darwin came along. And if you read Richard Dawkins' book called The Blind Watchmaker, in all honesty, he demolished Paley completely when it comes to the biological world. Completely. You'd have to read the book to appreciate what I'm trying to say. But Darwinian evolution has been established. There's enough data from different fields of biology, including molecular biology, to show that it occurs. That all of life is descended among common ancestries. And there are processes. In Darwin's time, they knew about that life was related. What Darwin found out new was he collected the evidence to show that there is a process called natural selection at play. And I'll show you what that means. And in modern neo-Darwinism, we know that there's random mutations that occur, changing the genetic material, along with natural selection, and that can actually explain, in principle, life without a watchmaker. It can, it has been demonstrated. Of course, the question remains, how far can it explain? We'll discuss that tonight. Another relates to what Jamil said. Look at how precisely the earth is in its position relative to the sun. There has to be a God. A good argument. If all you had was the sun and the earth. If all you had was the sun and the earth, and say, okay, you move the earth this way, no life. You move it closer, no life. Look how perfect it is. Yeah. The thing is, you don't have just the earth and the sun. Modern cosmology has shown us that there are billions of stars in a galaxy. And there are billions of galaxies in the visible universe. And the visible universe is just about 4 to 6% of what we can see. The rest, 94, 96%, is what's known as dark matter and dark energy, and we have no idea what it is. It's infinite, mind-boggling. So if you have such a huge system of heavenly bodies or celestial bodies, clearly chance and statistics will say that there's bound to be one in whereby the earth is going to be at the right location. It's like you play the lottery, yeah? Billions of people play, or millions of people play. There's going to be a winner who's going to hit the jackpot. It's just a matter of statistics. Nothing divine over there. So I'd like to demonstrate something about natural selection. So I want you guys to tell me, what are you seeing here?
So butterfly.
Butterfly. Any other thoughts?
Leaf.
A leaf.
A leaf. Thank you very much. So you said butterfly. Why did you say it was a butterfly?
See the wings. Like the morning.
But then Rovina said it's like a leaf, yeah? It's actually a butterfly. Or a moth, one of the two. Go on to the next slide. What else do you see here? This is known as a giant leaf bug.
Yeah.
Look at it. It looks like a leaf. It even's got the venules of a leaf. But you can see its head over there. Yeah? Go one more slide. That's another leaf, yeah? But it's actually a moth. Now, I'll tell you that I had witnessed something like this in person. In India, medical school. I was coming back from the hospital. I was going back home for lunch before I went for my afternoon classes. And I was climbing the stairs. And I was tired, it was hot, and I looked at it and I see a green leaf attached on the wall. And I'm like, how is this leaf defying gravity? It's attached on the wall. And I looked back and I'm like, this is awesome. It wasn't a leaf. Beautiful leaf-like structure, but you could see the body, the head and the abdomen and the thorax of the butterfly. How does that happen? Natural selection has shown, okay, and this has happened even during industrial Europe. I'll give an example of that. You see, what happens is that don't go for it, just go back, we'll come to this in a minute. If we look at these leaf-like creatures, imagine, in nature we know that living things feed on other living things, yes? So there is predator-prey relationship. Even we consume living things to survive, and we don't want to be consumed by predators. Imagine this guy is next to other leaves that look like that. Would a bird or a bat or any other flying creature be able to eat it?
No.
It will be camouflaged, yeah?
Yeah.
So, if he has a friend who looks a little less leafy than he does, or is completely different and stands out, what's going to be the fate of that butterfly?
Eaten.
It will be eaten, and most likely it won't reproduce. So he will be selected against, while this guy will be selected for. That's natural selection. If something by random mutation looks a little bit like a leaf in an environment that's leafy, it has a higher chance of surviving than the one that doesn't. And given enough time, the offspring that will come will look more and more leaf-like, and therefore they will survive. In principle, it's a very simple example of natural selection. And it even happened during Europe, whereby they went from before the industrial age to the industrial age, whereby pollution occurred and the butterflies or the moths who are white in color, they got eaten up. But those that match the suit in the trees, the dark in color, they tended to survive. And before you knew it, the white butterflies or moths were gone, and the ones that looked like the surrounding environment, they survived. Now here's an example of not natural selection, but actually artificial selection. And it's artificial selection actually is another proof that natural selection does work, or it exists. This is known as the Haiti crab. And if you look at it, what do you see over there? What does it look like that you're seeing?
Monster.
A monster, yes. A monster that has eyes, nose, mouth, yeah? Now, in 1185, they say the Haiti samurai clan was in a battle with a clan called the Genji clan, okay, in Japan. And when these Haitis were outnumbered, okay, the remaining samurais, they died. So there was a belief that they came back and reincarnated
Crabs.
as crabs. So what happens every time the fishermen went and fished crabs, when they saw something that looked a little bit like a face of a person or samurai, then what did they do? They threw it back into the ocean, because you do not eat something that is reincarnated. So what happens? Over time, you have crabs that coincidentally look like they have a face, and the ones that don't look like, well, they make good, crab meals, right, for human beings. So then you have a population of crabs that all have features like face-like features, and they keep on interbreeding. So then obviously with time you're going to get crabs with actually more defined features that look like a samurai's face. Is it design? Not in biology. This is the illusion of design. This is natural selection. But in this case it's artificial selection, because the humans are doing the selecting, not blind nature. So, with that introduction regarding natural selection, very briefly, what do the atheists and agnostics say? Because we live in a world whereby everything is connected and people are asking questions, and if you don't understand the other person's argument, you're going to lose, for sure, I guarantee you. So, to see if your beliefs hold water, you have to listen to the other, because at the end of the day we want truth, yes? We don't want what necessarily feels good. We want what is it true or not. So the atheists will say, we have the natural laws of physics. The law of gravity holds the planets. The laws of chemistry that govern reactions. And biology, or Darwin, to explain life of the universe. So why do you need God? That's their argument. They'll carry on. They'll say, well, if there is a God, and that God is good, and we all believe in a good God, yeah? Who wants to believe in a tyrannical God? Nobody would want to worship a tyrannical God, yeah? Then why so much suffering in life? And they'll expound upon that. Why would God create beings who will cause suffering to other beings? God knew very well that Hitler will come and he will murder 6 million Jews. He knew that Muslims will be massacred. He knew that these guys will be massacred. Children will die. And if you believe the story of Iblis, then he knew very well what Iblis would do, and yet he created him. So if God is good, then why does he do that? Moreover, there is also the existence of natural causes of suffering. While humans are not causing suffering, but nature is. Earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, like the one we had in Congo. Diseases like malaria. Malaria kills 500,000 to 1 million children every year, most of them under 5. So the atheists say, what kind of a God is that? These questions are not easy to answer. Whoever tells you they're easy is lying. I can't answer them properly. I have my own answers, but they might not satisfy me, my soul. They might satisfy the intellect, but they will never satisfy when you see loss of children through diseases. So nobody has the answers. But yet I'm going to make a case for God tonight. So another argument is, if God exists, he said everything had to have an initial cause. So, well then who created that God? That will be their argument. Furthermore, the belief in God or gods has caused continuous violence among human beings with fanaticisms. We see ISIS, yeah, we see extremism. That Richard Dawkins rightly calls it, if you ask me, that religions in many cases are viruses of the mind. Just as you have a computer program that destroys the computer, if you have an ideology that is destructive in nature, and then you believe that that's divinely ordained, without thinking and questioning and reasoning, then you are going to damage society. Again, what I disagree with him is that not all religious ideas are necessarily like that, but I get what he's trying to say. The atheist or the agnostic will say that religions are human attempts to provide answers for our existence. They are not testable and they can't be verified objectively. At least with science, we work with what we can see and we can verify it. So since science works fine without God, why do you need God? So this is the essence of the atheistic argument. And every other argument they make will be along these lines. And these are not foolish arguments. They are not. It will be us who are foolish if you think that this is foolish. So where are we in relation to God? Because I stand here not as an atheist, as a former atheist. I stand as somebody who believes in a divine principle rationality. So I contend, contrary to what Dawkins is saying, that we will never find a scientific proof for God, because it is not a scientific question. However, God is a philosophical question. This question, does God exist, is a one of philosophy. And philosophy, in a sense, predates science, because even science, before it was called science, in this case was known as natural philosophy. When Newton wrote his calculus thesis and he invented calculus, his book was called The Principles of Natural Philosophy. So from Socrates to Plato to Democritus, the Greeks, to Musa bin Maimun, Moses Maimonides, to Al-Razi, the Arabs, to Aquinas, to Berkeley, to Nietzsche. Philosophers and thinkers throughout the generations have argued either for God or against God. And philosophy deals with the overall picture to make sense of existence and reality in simple terms. For me personally, I ground my philosophical belief in a God based on these three arguments. Now, what I'm going to show tonight is not proof for God, but to show that the belief in God is rational. And I think it's much more likely than the belief in no God. Or as the saying goes, it takes more faith to be an atheist than to be a believer. I'm not arguing for any religion. I'm not arguing for the details. I'm just arguing for the existence of a God. So I've summarized this as the argument. The first argument will be the argument from the subjective nature of consciousness. The second will be the argument from quantum physics or quantum mechanics. And the third will be for the argument from mathematical probability. Now I'd like you all to close your eyes for a bit, because we're starting with the first argument. So to get an appreciation of what this is about, just close your eyes for a bit. And I want you all to think that we are, all of us right now, we're at Nungwi Beach. It's a beautiful night. Feel the breeze. See the moonlight. Just feel every sensation you can feel there. If you're sitting on the sand, feel the smoothness of the sand texture. Hear the waves. Now open your eyes. Whatever you witness right now, where was it taking place?
No, my own.
In your minds. So if I go into your head, at that point when you're thinking, would I see a picture of Nungwi? Or all the sensations that you had, the sounds, the texture? Because all that you're going to see in your skull is a very complex organ known as the brain, made up of millions of neurons, but their physical structure, material structure, ultimately they reduce to atoms and molecules. And yet, you had an image, a sensation that was subjective, that was qualitative, that was mind-like. So you didn't say it was in the brain, you said it was in the mind. But the reality is that the brain was necessary because there were parts of your brain, if we could hook up your brains to a functional MRI, there will be parts of the brain that would light up when you are having that thought that you just had. As I'm speaking right now, there are parts of my brain lighting up, channeling this thoughts. As you're understanding me, the parts of your brain's lighting up. But yet, you're understanding me in a subjective manner. You're understanding my concepts. We are discussing ideas. So, the question then arises, how can an object like the brain, no matter how complex, and it's probably the most complex organ in the known universe, the human brain, give rise to what's known as immaterial things, such as thoughts and the idea of the self? Because these are not matter, these are feelings, emotions, subjective sense of awareness. So the fact that a tiny mass of electrical firing jelly, if you like, we call the brain, can have rich and complex subjective experiences and self-awareness is truly baffling. And that is known as, in simple terms, the hard problem of consciousness. And from that you can build up all sorts of emotions. So when you love your child, yes, there is part of your brain that's lighting up and chemicals being released. But there's another side to that, which is the meaning of your love to your child. Your love for your child has a qualitative experience to it. It's not just molecules. It's not just matter. It means something. It means you'll always be there for them. It means that you give your life for them. It means you want their well-being above your well-being. It has value. Once you accept that, then you see that reality is not just made up of matter, but something that is psychological, that is value-based, that is subjective. So if the philosophical premise of materialistic monism, which is what the atheists said, that there is only matter in the universe, no God, only matter covered by physics, chemistry, biology, then there should not be any presence of subjective feelings. Because if you start with matter and you go all the way to complex matter, you can have a complex machine, why should at a given point a sense of subjectivity arise? You're dealing with one kind of substance, matter. There is no God, there is no mind, it's just matter. So it should be matter all the way, no matter how complex it becomes. But yet there is something else that is not matter. So I say no subjectivity, whether it's the most basic feeling, whether it's pain, pleasure, sense of smell, to the more complex ego, the sense of I, or the ability to think ideas and argue for God or against God, none of this should exist in a purely materialistic world. In fact, there are people who don't believe in God, but they are not materialists. They actually know as panpsychics. They believe that the universe ultimately has mind-like qualities, because that's what the logical implication is. So I said the subjective is irreducibly and qualitatively different from an object. It is irreducibly and qualitatively different from an object. And Darwin's theory, as amazing as it is, and I accept Darwinian theory as a man of science, I can't deny the facts, as amazing as it is, does not address the idea of consciousness. It doesn't. While they do say that consciousness can add survival advantage, true. So they give an example. Dawkins, in his book called The Climbing Mount Improbable, beautifully again talks about how the eye could have evolved through gradual selection of Darwin. So he shows, and he goes through data, not only theoretically, but they found primitive eyes that don't look like ours in the animal kingdom. They look like a simple disc and can sense light. So the argument goes that if you can sense a sense of light in primitive sense, then you may be able to avoid a predator, yeah? So you may be able to survive. And therefore with time that can get perfected and you have an eye as complex as ours. Given that the earth is 4.6 billion years old, it's possible. The earth is very old, it's 4.6 billion years old. Again, this is not opinion, this is science. There's a lot of evidence from different fields that show how old the Earth is. The universe is about 12 to 13 billion years old. And yet, I see a flaw in Dawkins' argument. He's absolutely right. Why should that first eye, I ask, why should that first primitive eye even have a sense of subjectivity? If it's just matter, and you're saying that it senses subjectivity and gets selected, but it's just matter, why should it even have in the first place to be selected? Unless that sense of subjectivity is inherent in the fabric of existence. Which means that the fabric of reality is not just material, but subjectivity. And we can all go on to feelings or sentience and mind as well. So again, I just recap what I have been saying, and I'm saying that based on this observation, the very presence of consciousness, the existence of consciousness, goes against the philosophy of materialistic atheism. And yet, consciousness from the most simple and unaware to the most complex and self-aware exists like a ghost in a machine. If we can accept that, and there are atheists who will still not accept this observation, you can't convince them. But to me it seems perfectly rational that this argument is valid. If consciousness exists as a fundamental, irreducible part of reality, then that would make the existence of a supreme consciousness even more plausible. It's not as far-fetched. Because if we live in a universe that's mind-like in essence, then a source that is the mind could be there. Or the universe itself could be ultimately intelligent, that is God, that we can't even understand, and we are part of that intelligence. I'd like to come to the second argument for God's existence, which I said was the argument from quantum mechanics and quantum physics. I am not a physicist, but a lover of physics and science. Some of the greatest physicists have said, Richard Feynman was a theoretical physicist who got the Nobel Peace Prize for his discovery or postulations of what's known as quantum electrodynamics. I can barely pronounce it. I don't know what he meant by that. I know Feynman as a teacher was a brilliant educator and teacher. But Feynman said that if you think you understand quantum physics, you don't understand quantum physics. While one of the pioneers of quantum mechanics, Niels Bohr, said that if you are not shocked by the findings of quantum physics, then you don't understand quantum physics. Now let me give you a little bit brief history about quantum mechanics and come to this image right here. Just go back a page. In the early 1900s, they thought that everything about physics was known. And physics is a science that explains the universe. It's a science by which technologies are even built from. So everything that we know about applied technology comes from physics. So what we had back then was Newtonian physics. And they would say, there was a guy called Lord Kelvin, like the Kelvin temperature. He said that everything in physics has been discovered. What matters is just the minute details. And yet, in the 1920s, when Max Planck, they tried to apply Newtonian mechanics to understand the atom and the electron, they saw that the laws of motion that govern the planets were failing to explain how the electrons orbit the atom, among other things. So a whole new field of quantum theory was born. And a bunch of scientists, many of them, came together and started chipping in. So people like Albert Einstein, who hated quantum theory, but he helped found it. Max Planck, Niels Bohr, Erwin Schrödinger, Heisenberg, and so on. Even Marie Curie was the only woman in that group. And there's a famous photograph when they met in Copenhagen. You see all these men, and you see Madame Curie over there. They discovered a whole new aspect of physics that actually is not only theoretical, but is the reason why you have cell phones. Is the reason why we have MRIs. The fact that cell phones work and MRIs work is not magic. It's because of quantum mechanics. And quantum mechanics is so accurate, it's more even accurate than Newtonian mechanics. So this is a science that has an applicative aspect. But yet, this science, one can say, brought back God into the picture. Because if you have a closed universe that is mechanistic, then you don't need God. So in comes this experiment that happened in the 70s, I believe. This is known as the double slit experiment. So they knew up till then that electron was a particle. So we all know, right? In school we were taught that you have the atom, and you have the, in the nucleus you have the protons and the neutrons, positive charge, no charge, and then you have the electrons around the orbit. So hydrogen has one electron, helium a second, and so on. So we saw them as particles. So what they decided to do was throw in particles. They made a slit, okay, and this is science, it's experiment, it's not even speculation. And they started pushing the first image, okay? They were firing electrons, not seeing inside what's happening and seeing the outcome result. Now, they were expecting that what they would see is because the slits were going through two slits, then they would see at the end of the image two lines being formed over time. Because it's like if you throw tennis balls through two slits, they're going to hit the wall if they're going straight. But what they end up seeing was they saw a pattern, was known as a diffraction pattern, which looked like a wave. Because if you put a trough of water through those two slits, the water is going to diffract. And as it hits the wall, you're going to get part of the wave hitting here, 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 and here. So you're going to see a wave-like pattern. So they say, hang on, electrons are particles. Why do we see waves? Which hole is it going into? Which slit is it going into? So they said, let's take a peek. Let's shine a light, hit the electron, and then see, aha, it's in this position, so it's going to that slit. When they did that, they took a peek and a device was looking. That same electron, instead of forming that pattern, started behaving like a particle. Until today, nobody has an explanation for this. You don't look, the electron behaves like a wave. You try to see where is it going, it behaves like a particle. And so the equation that governs this is known as Schrodinger's equation, of which I don't understand. But Schrodinger's equation, when taken literally, says that this electron, before entering those two slits, is everywhere. It's undefined. So Heisenberg, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, said that atoms are not things. Atoms are tendencies, possibilities. Now remember, atoms are what make up the universe. Atoms is what makes you and me and everyone here, because ultimately we all go into atoms. If this is literally true, then in principle, we're just potentiality. And yet, here we are. I don't see many Hassans or many Ruhina. I see Hassan over there. By me observing, I see you over there. By you observing, you see me here. It is as if us observing each other is collapsing and making this wave behave like a particle. So, how does this relate to God? Well, for one thing, it already suggests the possibility that what we call as real is not hard and solid, but it's a wave-like potentiality. So, according to quantum physics, objects are not determined things. Objects are possibilities and probability. Now, there are different ways of interpreting this. The physicists have not agreed. They know it works. Some have gotten annoyed and they say, shut up and calculate. Don't ask such questions, just do the math, it works. But people who want to understand, they'll say, no, what does it actually mean? So, one understanding says that everything exists in potentiality, but somehow us observing reality make things into physical existence. Now, quantum mechanics poses a lot of paradoxical problems that I can't go into this discussion tonight. But apparently, the physicists who've argued for this understanding have said that if you flip the reality and say that the reality is not matter, but the mind of God, and said that these equations say that everything exists as potentiality in the mind of God, then all these paradoxes in modern physics can be resolved. And this has been illustrated very nicely by retired physicist Amit Goswami. I think he's still alive, he's a very old man. I read his book, The Self-Aware Universe, when I was an atheist going back to agnosticism. By the time I was done with his book, I had no choice but to accept some sort of God. And he argued, as a physicist, for the layperson, you just have to like science, you never have to know much physics. He'll take you through the arguments and ultimately make the case that all these contradictions they're having in modern physics can be resolved if we assume that reality is not material, but reality is mind. And matter is just potentiality in mind. And so, that's the image of the book over there. That's a new edition, by the way. A couple of years ago it came out. But if Goswami's hypothesis is correct, then that would make divine consciousness the fabric of reality. And this has been going back to quantum, before quantum physics, the time of philosophers. There used to be materialistic atheists, there used to be dualists who said there's matter and there's mind, and then there were the idealists, the Vedantists, Hindus, the Sufi mystics, who said that there's nothing but the mind of God. So mind is the ultimate reality. Matter is an illusion. Not what the atheist said, that mind is an illusion, matter is a reality. My third argument for the case of God is the argument from probability. Now Galileo Galilei said that mathematics is the language with which God wrote the universe. And if you take probability, you can make some very interesting arguments for God's existence. And what Jamil said, for example, about the earth, perfection of the earth, that can actually be taken at a higher level of the universe, where it actually does make sense. Because the earth, I explained it, you can have billions of planets, you're bound to have one that's perfectly tuned. But what if it applied to something else? We're going to see right now. Who knows the story of the Goldilocks and the Three Bears? Yeah. Who wants to briefly say what the story is?
Everything was just right.
Everything was just right. So Goldilocks is the girl, and these are the three bears: Papa Bear, Mama Bear, and Baby Bear. And so Goldilocks goes into this house belonging to the bears, and she sees porridge, and that's the first porridge, and it's too cold. This is too cold. And the second porridge, this is too hot. And then she goes to the baby's porridge, and it's just the right temperature, and says, this is just right. She goes to the living room and sits on a chair. Oh, this one's too big. This one's even bigger. No, but this small one is just right. She goes into the bed, and she finds the bed that's just right. And then the bears come home, and like, what's happening? And then she runs out. Okay, so that's the Goldilocks story. Now, why am I including this here? Because astronomers and astrophysicists and cosmologists have what they call the Goldilocks enigma. There are certain properties that astrophysics has discovered that show that they are there. They have no reason to be there, but they are there in just the right amount of proportion to one another. They are just right. That is one of the most strongest arguments from God from astrophysics. That even certain atheists will say that that is a good argument, even though they may not accept it. So this one is a fine-tuning of the universe. So how the atheists avoid it by saying that, well, there's a possibility that there are going to be multiple infinite universes, and ours is just one of them, even though they haven't been detected yet. Although I say that even if that's the case, it doesn't still rule out the existence of God because of the other arguments that I have presented. But then, so you have one hypothesis that infinite universes, so one, ours just happens to be right, that has this fine-tuning, which we're going to see right now. So ours had to have life. Or, there's only the universe we know of, and it just has the right amount of stuff. And this is before Darwinian natural selection comes into play. Like it just has the ingredients for life. What do I mean, Jamil? Bear with me, it's a bit of physics and astronomy. I'll make it simple, it's going to be interesting. There's something known as the force of gravity. You all know about the force of gravity, yeah? You throw an apple up, it comes down. You jump from a building, you fall down. So that gravity exists from the macroscopic world into the microscopic world. And then there's something known as the electric force. So electricity is a flow of electrons. The fact that we have electricity is that electrons flow. Electricity works due to electrons having negative charge. We know that from high school physics. Electrons repel other electrons and they attract protons. We also know that. So far so good. However, we also know that electrons and protons are particles. In addition to being wave-like structures, we just saw, they're ultimately particles as well. So because they're particles, they have very small amount of gravitational pull. So they have charge, they attract each other, protons and electrons, or they repel 2 electrons away, but they also have gravity, they can tend to pull one another. So the astrophysicists have observed that the ratio of this gravity between the electrons and the protons to the electric force of repulsion or attraction is so precise that if the gravitational force of the electron was just 10 times more stronger than it is now relative to the electric force of the electron, the stars, including our sun, would be smaller and short-lived. In fact, today our sun would not exist because it would have burnt out if this ratio was just off by a factor of 10. Our sun is about 4.6 billion years old. It's a very young sun. Although it's halfway through its life, they estimate in the next 5 million years, it will die. It will burn out. We won't be here to see it. But if nothing comes, from above, yeah? Also, if this ratio was 10 times more, the planets would be smaller and denser, and galaxies would be closer, so then stars would come close to planets, climate would be affected, and therefore if climate gets affected consistently, then life cannot evolve. Life cannot even start. If it gets started, it gets destroyed. I mean, think about it. The dinosaurs were wiped out millions of years ago, 65 million years ago, because of a huge asteroid. We have evidence for that. And the reason why we're still alive is probably because of Jupiter is there protecting us. The planet Jupiter is taking all the comets away from our planet. Else we would be long gone. So if the gravity was slightly weaker instead of stronger to the electric force, the astrophysicists tell us that through their calculations, fewer stars and planets on which life can arise will be formed. So we will not have as many planets as we do, and therefore if you have less planets, then you have less planets that can harbor life, because you need a lot of conditions for life. Life would not exist. We would not exist. So the 4 forces of nature, in simple terms, are what's known as the strong nucleus force, whereby it's between the proton and the neutron pulling each other, holding the atom together. Don't worry about the weak force right now. We're not going to look into that. There's the electromagnetic force, is the electrical force I just described. And then there's the gravitational force, which we just talked about. So another fine-tuning of the universe, besides the first ratio we talked about, was the nuclear force. And bear with me, we're almost done, okay? If the nuclear force, this thing that I showed you the image by the proton and the neutron attract each other, were 10 to 20% stronger than what it is right now in nature, all the hydrogen, and hydrogen comes from the sun, all the elements, did you know that you are star stuff? If anybody asks why, you say, I'm a star. It's true. We are all star stuff. Because we came from the earth, yeah? And all the planets, including the atoms, come from the sun. In fact, even now, the sun creates hydrogen and helium. So all of us are actually from the stars if you go back long enough, before the human being was even formed or life was formed. So if the nuclear force was 10 to 20% stronger than what it is, all the hydrogen would be used up, there would be no stars, therefore no planets, and no life. And if the nuclear force was just 10 to 20% weaker than what it is, then stars would not get the energy they need to power. They would collapse in what's known as black holes, and there would be no shining stars. So the argument that Jamil said about the Earth being just right is more applicable here Because here you have nothing to compare, you have the only universe that we know of, and yet it is just right. And the last example I would like to give you this topic, or this subtopic, is there's something known as dark matter. I said that the visible universe is matter is about 4 to 6%. The remaining 90 or 95% is dark matter, dark energy. So there's something known as dark matter, and dark matter has been found to be 5 to 6 times more abundant in the universe than regular matter that we can see. This ratio makes it possible to form galaxies, they say, and therefore stars with planetary systems that can harbor life. In other words, if it wasn't at this ratio, again, stars and planets would not form. There is no naturalistic reason. If you just have one universe and you sit and figure out that these three properties have the values there, if they were off by just a little bit, we wouldn't be here discussing God. We wouldn't. And it's not just three. Hang on. It's not just three. I took this out from The Purpose Guided Universe by the astrophysicist Bernard Heish. Some scientists said that there are over 200 such properties in cosmology that are just right. But Mr. Heish, or Dr. Heish as you said, talks about what I mentioned, 3 of them here from his work, but he mentioned others that you could read this on your own when I give you the slides. But if each of this was just off, now calculate the probability odds of that, of having it just right. And that's why the person who doesn't believe in God will say that then there are probably multiple infinite universes and ours just happen to be the one, which you have yet to find out. They're not testable, we can't see. Or you say there's only one universe, then how do you explain this? How in God's name you explain it? God, yeah? Okay. That's the book, by the way, I highly recommend it. I have the Kindle version of this, if you can get a hold of it, really nice book. It's called The Purpose Guided Universe, Believing in Einstein, Darwin, and God. And he says that God needs Darwin. That's his line. God needs Darwin because God creates life through Darwinian evolution. He believes in God. This part here just summarizes the fact that natural selection and random mutations are propelling life. But the question remains, even though I believe natural selection exists, is it enough to create life in its complexity? That is a question that is yet to be fully answered. It is assumed to be so. But for example, there's a biochemist called Michael Behe, a biochemist, who wrote a book that I read a long time ago called Darwin's Black Box. And even wrote a book later, which I haven't read, called The Age of Evolution. He has calculated mathematically to show that there are systems in nature that are so complex that even Darwinian evolution has a hard time explaining them. So in Darwin's Black Box, he talked about something called irreducible complexity. A lot of scientists don't agree with him. Some people who believe in God don't agree with him. Maybe he is wrong, but he raises some very interesting questions. The things are so complex that can natural selection really explain everything? Or are there things we don't understand? And lastly, this is a book that was published, I think, in the 80s, and it created such a furor in the scientific community that the then editor of Nature magazine, who's dead now, Sir John Maddox, said that this book should be burnt. And he said that this book is heresy, just as there was heresy in the Catholic Church back in the days of the time of Galileo. It's ironic, right, that as a scientist he was saying that. And he said that this should be burnt. And yet it wasn't burnt. I even used to own this book. I don't have it with me right now, but I did read it. There's something known as the problem of morphogenesis. When a baby is being born in the mother's womb, every cell in that baby is known as a stem cell. And it contains all the information to make the complete human being. But during the process of development, some of those stem cells differentiate and become different organ systems. So it starts as the same stem cell, but then there are genetic switches on and off being turned on and off that would create the heart, the lungs, the liver, the brain, the eyes. It would ultimately, this whole process is known as morphogenesis. And despite us knowing so much about genetics and how it works, developmental biologists are still trying to figure out how morphogenesis occurs. Where is that information quoted that actually forms that neural tube to form into an organ system? It's the same recipe, same ingredients, but yet some of it turn into this, some into that, and so on. Where is that information guiding that? Nobody knows. So this biologist, and he was a very famous biologist, still is, he actually discovered the hormone auxin in plants. He said that you can't find it because the information is not there. It's not in the genes. Okay? So he put a hypothesis saying that there is memory in nature. And he called that morphic fields. Just as a magnet has a magnetic field, yeah? So if you put iron filings on a magnet, it will arrange it out of the field. He said that everything in nature has a field. So he looks for arguments to show that this hypothesis is true. He has some very interesting findings. It's still a hypothesis, it's not confirmed. But Sheldrake's hypothesis really challenges the materialistic universe. So Darwinian theory again lacks in this regard, because Darwinian theory says absolutely nothing about how a cell differentiates into organs with various parts, shapes, and functions. So surely morphogenesis, the development into form of a living being, is essential in the function and survival and therefore evolution of complex organisms. And yet natural selection, as beautiful as it is still too simplistic and does not address these issues. Sheldrake's hypothesis postulates a universe that has an inherent memory, and he looks for scientific data to validate it. And he's got, if you go on his website called sheldrake.org, he's got very interesting research over there. But that leads to the possibility that the universe is mind-like and not purely blind and material. So, with that lecture on astronomy and biology and philosophy and psychology, I'd like to end this talk with this beautiful verse of the Quran, which says, سَنُرِيهِمْ آيَاتِنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَهُمْ أَنَّهُ الْحَقُّ أَوَلَمْ يَكْفِ بِرَبِّكَ أَنَّهُ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ شَهِيدٌ. Arbery translates as saying, we shall show them our signs in the horizons, and in themselves it is clear to them that it is the truth. Suffice it not as to thy Lord that he is witness about everything. What's interesting is that there's only one translation that translates this a bit differently, that I feel personally is much more righter or much more correct. And that was Professor Carl Ernst in his book How to Read the Quran. He translates it saying that the first verse, it doesn't say that we'll show them our signs until they realize it is the truth, it meaning the Quran, but rather we'll show them our signs until they realize that he is the truth. And look at the Arabic, because the word for it or he is annahu, the same annahu that is used over there for God. This verse, to me, tells me that the signs of nature are over there, and as we go deeper, we'll find out divinity. And one Heisenberg, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, said that science is like drinking a cup of water. I'm paraphrasing, okay, right now. If you drink it halfway, you'll be an atheist. To find God, you have to drink it all the way down. Thank you very much.